I need to tell someone what I did. Not because confession will fix anything, there's nobody left to absolve me. And the God I used to pray to has been quiet since the power grid died, but because my daughter is sleeping 12 feet from me. And if something happens tonight, someone should understand why I made the choices that brought us here. My name is Dr. Elliot Voss. I was a veterinary immunologist at the University of Arizona's College of Veterinary Medicine. I studied zoonotic crossover events, the invisible bridges that diseases build between species when ecosystems compress. For 11 years, I mapped how pathogens jumped from bats to livestock to humans, publishing papers that 600 people read and nobody funded. I was not a soldier. I was not a survivalist. I was a man who understood, at the molecular level, exactly how biological systems are hijacked from inside. And that knowledge became the cruelest thing I own. 41 days ago, the Reno-Tahoe corridor collapsed in 9 hours. Not slowly, the way the movies imagined, no weeks of creeping news footage, no incremental government briefings. 9 hours from the first 911 call to total systemic failure. I was at the lab when the university sent the shelter-in-place alert. I ignored it. I drove 7 miles in 14 minutes to the elementary school on Plum Lane, collected my daughter Lily from a gym full of screaming children and 2 teachers who had already locked the exterior doors, and drove home to our house on East Shore Drive. My wife, Maren, was not there. Maren was a large animal veterinarian who worked mobile calls across 4 counties. That morning, she had driven to a cattle operation near Fallon, 63 miles east, to handle a calving complication. Her last text arrived at 11:47 a.m. Running late, calf breach, love you both. I replied at 11:48 with a photograph of the alert on my phone and the words, "Come home now." She never responded. By 4 p.m., I watched the first infected person from our living room window. He was our mailman, Gerald, a man who had delivered our packages for 3 years and always complimented Lily's chalk drawings on the driveway. He was walking north on East Shore Drive with a gait I recognized immediately, not from cinema, but from my lab work. Cerebellar ataxia overlaid with hyperkinetic bursts. The motor cortex was firing in recursive loops, generating movement without coordination. His jaw was dislocated on the left side. His mailbag still hung from his shoulder. Lily asked why Gerald was walking funny. I told her he was sick. I pulled the curtains and locked every door in the house. Then I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator and did what my training had wired me to do. I started building a differential diagnosis for a pathogen that could produce these symptoms within hours of exposure. Rapid onset encephalitis with motor preservation. Autonomic function sustained. Higher cognition ablated. Aggressive behavioral disinhibition. The closest analog in my professional vocabulary was a turbocharged rabies variant, something that had found a way to skip the long prodromal phase entirely and go straight to furious stage presentation while keeping the host ambulatory. The transmission vector was obviously fluid exchange. Bite wounds, blood contact, the classics. I understood what was happening faster than anyone on our street. That understanding bought me nothing but a more detailed picture of how doomed we were. For 9 days, Lily and I stayed in the house. I fortified what I could with furniture and screws from the garage. I rationed the pantry into a grid on the kitchen table: calorie counts, protein thresholds, water reserves calculated to the ounce. I was good at this. Variables and systems, inputs and outputs. It kept me from thinking about Maren's phone going to voicemail every time I called. The automated voice eventually replaced by a network unavailable tone, then by nothing at all. On the 9th night, Lily looked at me from her sleeping bag, on the living room floor and asked if Mommy was dead. I told her I didn't know. That was the last honest thing I said for a long time. On day 10, I made the decision to leave. The calculus was simple. The house was not defensible long term. The food grid showed 17 days remaining at reduced intake. And the infected density on our street had shifted from occasional stragglers to patterned movement groups of 4 and 5 drifting north in loose clusters every 40 minutes. Responsive to sound and motion within approximately 30 yards. I had been cataloging their behavior through a gap in the upstairs blinds, filling a yellow legal pad with observations the way I would document a diseased herd. Stimulus thresholds, response latency, diurnal variation in activity levels. The scientist in me was fascinated. The father in me was counting windows. The university campus was 6 miles southwest. My lab had a reinforced basement climate-controlled specimen storage designed to maintain biosafety level 2 containment. Steel door, independent ventilation, a backup generator with a 40-day fuel supply that nobody outside the veterinary college even knew existed. If it hadn't been breached, it was the safest room within walking distance. I packed 2 bags. One for supplies, one for Lily's things, her stuffed rabbit, her reading book, a photograph of Marin from the hallway. I didn't tell Lily where we were going. I told her we were going to Daddy's work, where it was safe and quiet. She accepted this with the terrifying compliance children develop when fear has become their baseline. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She put on her shoes, pulled the straps of her backpack tight, and stood by the garage door with her rabbit pressed against her sternum. We left through the backyard at 4:15 a.m., moving south through the green belt that connected our subdivision to the next. I carried a claw hammer in my right hand and Lily's hand in my left. We saw 11 infected during the 90-minute walk. I avoided 9 of them through stillness and route adjustment. 2 were unavoidable. I struck the first across the temple when it lunged from behind a parked truck. The sound it made when it fell, a wet, mechanical sound, like a phone dropped in bathwater, will occupy a drawer in my memory that I cannot lock. The second was a woman in hospital scrubs, sitting motionless against a chain-link fence. She turned her head as we passed, but did not rise. Her eyes tracked Lily, not me. I pulled Lily closer and walked faster. The lab was intact. The building had been abandoned mid-evacuation. Papers were scattered across the atrium floor, and someone had knocked over the skeleton model from the anatomy wing. Its plastic bones fanned across the hallway like a grim welcome mat. But the basement was untouched. The steel door was closed. The generator kicked on with the second pull. The air system hummed to life, and the fluorescent lights above the specimen refrigerators painted everything in that familiar institutional white that I had spent 11 years cursing and now found profoundly beautiful. I set Lily up in the corner with blankets from the emergency supply closet and told her this was our fort. She asked if forts had windows. I told her the best forts didn't need them. For 22 days, we lived in the basement. I made supply runs every third night fast, surgical loops through the campus dining hall and the veterinary pharmacy. I recovered canned food, bottled water, 2 boxes of granola bars, antibiotics, and a partial case of ketamine vials that I kept in the specimen fridge in case I ever needed emergency sedation or a way out I wasn't willing to name. I rationed everything on a new grid. I read to Lily from the textbooks on my shelf. Editing the content in real time, zoonotic transmission became great, how animals share their germs, and herd immunity became how a group protects its weakest member. She absorbed everything with the quiet intensity of a child who has intuited that knowledge is the only currency left. On day 31, I heard footsteps above us. Not the arrhythmic shuffle of the infected. Deliberate, bipedal, evenly spaced footsteps. Then, a knock on the steel door. Then my wife's voice. "Elliot? Elliot, it's me. I'm here." I want to describe what happened to my body when I heard her voice. Because the body is what understood first. My hands went rigid around the textbook I was holding, not shaking, locked. My diaphragm contracted so sharply that the breath I released sounded like a word, though it wasn't. My vision narrowed to the steel door 12 feet in front of me, and my pulse, which I had trained myself to monitor throughout our time in the basement, jumped from 68 to 114 in what felt like a single beat. I know this because I pressed my fingers to my carotid automatically, the way I'd check an animal's vitals before a procedure. The scientist didn't pause. The scientist was already working. Lily sat up from her blankets. "Daddy? Stay there, sweetheart." I walked to the door. There was no window, no viewport. I had considered this a feature during the fortification phase. Now it was a wall between me and the only voice I had grieved for 31 days. "Elliot, please, I can hear you. I've been walking for so long." Her voice, not an approximation, not the uncanny valley mimicry that some of the later stage infected produced, the guttural repetitions of frequently used words, stripped of syntax, deployed as lures. This was Marin. The specific cadence she used when exhausted, the way she dropped the second syllable of Elliot when she was scared, so it came out almost as Elt. The slight nasality from the deviated septum she'd had since college. These were not reproducible features. These were the acoustic fingerprint of a specific human being. "How did you find us?" I asked through the door. "I went home first. You left the note on the fridge." I had. A yellow sticky note with the lab's building number and the words "basement," knocked 3 times. She had knocked once. "Marin, I need you to answer something. Anything. What did Lily name her rabbit?" A pause. "Captain Biscuit. She named him Captain Biscuit because he's brown and brave." That detail, brown and brave, was Lily's exact phrasing from the story she'd invented for the rabbit during a road trip to Tahoe 18 months earlier. It wasn't a fact someone could guess or extract. It was embedded in the private architecture of our family, a load-bearing detail that only 3 people in the world had ever heard. I opened the door. She stood in the hallway under the emergency fluorescent strip, wearing the same Carhartt jacket she'd left the house in 31 days earlier, now filthy and torn at the left elbow. Her hair was matted against her skull. Her boots were caked in something dark and geological. She was thinner, dramatically thinner. The tendons in her neck visible, her clavicles pressing against skin that looked papery and dehydrated. Her eyes found mine and filled with tears. "I thought you were dead," she said. "I thought you were dead," I said. Lily broke past me before I could stop her. She slammed into Marin's legs with a force that nearly toppled both of them. And Marin dropped to her knees and pulled our daughter into her chest and made a sound that I cannot transcribe. The sound of a woman holding the thing she crossed 63 miles of hell to touch. I stood in the doorway and watched my family reassemble. And here is where I must be honest with you, because honesty is the entire point of this document. While my wife held my daughter and cried on the basement floor, I was already cataloging. I couldn't stop. Pupil diameter, slightly dilated but consistent with low light adaptation. Skin pallor, significant but attributable to malnutrition and dehydration. Respiratory rate, elevated, consistent with exertion and emotion. No visible bite wounds on exposed skin. No ataxic gait upon entry. no dislocated joints, no behavioral perseveration. She passed every field test my mind could generate in that moment. I knelt beside them and wrapped my arms around both of them and let myself believe she was my wife. I want you to understand that I did not choose belief carelessly. The first anomaly appeared 6 hours after her return. We had eaten together canned soup heated on the portable burner I'd rigged from lab equipment, and Marin had told us her story. She'd been at the Fallon Ranch when the collapse reached rural Churchill County. The rancher's wife had heard it on the radio first. By midday, the highway back to Reno was impassable overturned vehicles, fire, and the infected already moving in loose columns along the shoulders. Marin had sheltered in the ranch's equipment barn for 3 days, then started walking west when the rancher was bitten by a neighboring property owner who had come to the fence line asking for help. She'd walked at night, hidden during the day, drank from irrigation ditches, eaten what she found in abandoned vehicles. 63 miles in 28 days, with detours that tripled the actual distance. The story was coherent, detailed, and emotionally consistent. She cried at the right moments. She paused where memory hurt. She reached for Lily's hand when the narrative required comfort. I noted all of this, and I noted that I was noting it, and I hated myself for both layers of observation. Then she fell asleep. I had set up a second sleeping area for her beside Lily's 2 folded blankets on the specimen room floor. A rolled lab coat as a pillow. She curled on her side the way she always had, left arm tucked under, right hand resting near her face. Lily pressed against her back and fell asleep within minutes, her small body conforming to her mother's with the practiced geometry of 1,000 shared naps. I sat in the chair by the generator console and watched them. And I counted. Marin's resting respiratory rate had always been 14 breaths per minute. I knew this because I had monitored her once during a camping trip when she'd caught a chest cold, and I was worried about pneumonia. 14 breaths, steady, with a slight lengthening on the exhale that I'd always found calming. That night, in the basement, I counted 11 breaths per minute. The exhales were not lengthened. They were truncated, sharp terminations, as if each breath were being managed rather than autonomically regulated. 11 breaths per minute is not pathological. It falls within the normal adult range. A person who had been walking for 28 days in survival conditions might well have developed a more efficient respiratory pattern. The body adapts. This is basic physiology. I wrote the number on my legal pad and circled it. At 3 a.m., I approached her silently and knelt beside her. I placed 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist, the radial pulse point I had checked 10,000 times on sedated animals. Her pulse was 44 beats per minute. Athletic bradycardia in a woman who had never been athletic. Marin hated running. She walked the dogs at a pace that annoyed me. Her resting heart rate, historically, sat around 72. 44 was not alarming in isolation. Endurance exertion over weeks could produce cardiac adaptation. Marathon runners lived in the 40s. But Marin had not been running marathons. She had been walking and hiding and starving. I wrote the number below the first and stared at the 2 figures until the generator's hum became indistinguishable from the sound inside my own skull. In the morning, she woke smiling. She kissed Lily's forehead. She asked me if we had coffee, and when I laughed and said no, she made a face, the exact theatrical grimace she'd always made, upper lip curled, nose wrinkled, and said, "Civilization is truly over." Lily giggled. The sound cracked something in the room that had been sealed for 31 days. I handed Marin a bottle of water and watched her drink. She consumed the entire 16 ounces in 4 swallows, without breathing between them. Most humans pause instinctively when drinking, a respiratory reflex that interrupts swallowing every 5 to 6 seconds. She did not pause. I added a third line to the legal pad and put it in my back pocket. On the second day, I conducted a physical examination. I framed it as medical concern. She had walked 63 miles through active outbreak terrain, and I needed to check for wounds, infection, dehydration markers. Marin agreed without hesitation. She sat on the steel specimen table under the fluorescent lights and extended her arms, turned her head, opened her mouth. Compliant, patient, familiar. I started with her skin. No bite wounds, no lacerations consistent with infected contact. Several abrasions on her forearms and shins, trail injuries, brush scratches, the kind of superficial damage a month of cross-country walking would produce. A deep bruise on her left hip that she said came from falling into a dry wash on night 12. The bruise was yellow-green at the edges, consistent with a healing timeline of approximately 2 weeks. The dating matched her story. Her lymph nodes were not swollen. Her pupils were equal and reactive, though the reaction time was, and I measured this, with a pen light 3 times approximately 0.2 seconds slower than the standard 0.1 second constriction response. A delay that small is clinically meaningless. It falls within normal variation. I noted it anyway. Her oral mucosa was pale but intact. Tongue midline. No fasciculations, no tremor in her extended hands. Grip strength symmetrical and stronger, actually, than I remembered. When I squeezed her fingers in the standard grip test, she squeezed back with a force that surprised me. I said nothing. She smiled and asked if she passed. "Flying colors," I said. Then I checked her temperature. I used the infrared thermometer from the lab's animal intake station, accurate to 0.1 degrees, calibrated quarterly. I aimed it at her temporal artery and pressed the trigger. 96.1 degrees Fahrenheit. I checked it again. 96.0. A third time. 96.1. Normal human core temperature is 98.6, with a range of 97.0 to 99.0 considered unremarkable. Hypothermia begins at 95.0. At 96.1, Marin was below the normal range, but above the clinical threshold for concern. Chronic malnutrition can suppress basal metabolic temperature. Sleep deprivation and caloric deficit produce thermoregulatory depression. There were explanations available for every number I had collected, and each explanation was individually plausible. But the aggregate was building a shape I recognized. In veterinary epidemiology, we called it the subclinical profile, the animal that passes every individual test while failing the pattern. The cow whose milk yield drops 4%, whose temperature sits 1 degree below herd average, whose white cell count hovers at the low end of normal. No single metric triggers intervention, but the experienced clinician learns to see the silhouette formed by the cluster, the way a constellation is invisible star by star, but undeniable in aggregate. I was seeing a silhouette, and I couldn't yet name the shape. That afternoon, Marin played with Lily. They built a tower out of specimen boxes and textbooks, a game that had no precedent in our family history, but one that Marin facilitated with patience and creativity. Laughing when the tower collapsed, helping Lily rebuild with architectural suggestions that seemed entirely natural. I watched from the workstation where I was reorganizing the medical supplies, and I felt 2 things simultaneously. Gratitude so large it pressed against the walls of the room, and a clinical suspicion so precise it could fit on the head of a pin. At dinner, I heated 2 cans of chicken noodle soup. Lily ate hers entirely. I ate most of mine. Marin held her bowl in both hands, brought it to her lips, and drank the broth in a continuous pour. She set the bowl down with the noodles and chicken untouched at the bottom. When I asked about it, she said her stomach was still adjusting, that solid food had been hard since the second week of walking. The explanation was plausible. Refeeding after prolonged starvation often begins with liquids. But I watched her eyes as she looked at the remaining solids in the bowl. And what I saw was not nausea or reluctance. It was indifference, the kind of disinterest a cat shows toward a food it has not been imprinted on. Not rejection, absence of category. I didn't write anything on the legal pad that night. I didn't need to. The list was becoming architecture, and I was living inside it. Day 4 introduced a new variable. I woke at 2 a.m. to find Marin standing in the center of the basement, not pacing, not moving toward anything, standing. Her arms were at her sides. Her eyes were open. Her face held no expression, not blankness exactly, but a kind of suspended animation, as if the muscles responsible for affect had been powered down, while the rest of the system continued to operate. I watched her for 7 minutes from the chair where I'd fallen asleep. In those 7 minutes, she did not shift her weight. She did not blink. She did not adjust her hands or turn her head toward the ambient sound of the generator. She stood with the absolute stillness of a medical mannequin, breathing at her reduced rate of 11 per minute, her pupils fixed on a point on the far wall that held nothing of interest. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, she walked back to the blankets, lay down beside Lily, and closed her eyes. The transition from standing to movement had no preparatory phase, no stretch, no yawn, no gradual reorientation. She went from static to mobile in a single frame. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. In the morning, I asked her about it. "You were standing up in the middle of the night. Were you sleepwalking?" She looked at me with genuine surprise. Was I? I used to do that as a kid. My mom said I'd stand in the hallway for 20 minutes and then go back to bed. This was true. She had told me this story early in our relationship, during the inventory of personal histories that new couples conduct like parallel audits. Her mother had filmed it once, a 7-year-old Marin standing in the hallway of their Flagstaff house, eyes open, seeing nothing. The explanation fit. Stress-induced somnambulism in a person with a childhood history. Textbook. Reasonable. The kind of detail that actively resists suspicion, because it arrives with its own provenance, its own corroborating narrative, its own comfortable shape. But the 7 minutes of absolute stillness were not consistent with typical sleepwalking, which involves ambulatory movement, partial responsiveness, and micro-adjustments in posture. What I had witnessed was more consistent with a system in standby mode, an organism conserving energy between active cycles, maintaining only autonomic function while higher processes were suspended. I began designing a test. Not consciously at first, the architecture assembled itself in the background while I played cards with Lily and heated soup, and performed the domestic choreography of a man whose family was reunited. But beneath that surface, the immunologist was building an assay. The question I needed to answer was deceptively simple. Was Marin's behavior being generated by Marin's brain? Or was it being generated by something that had learned to operate Marin's brain? The distinction matters more than you might think. A parasite that destroys its host is easy to identify. The damage is visible. The behavior is alien. The host is functionally gone. But a parasite that preserves its host, that maintains the neural architecture, accesses the memory systems, reproduces the behavioral outputs, while redirecting the organism's fundamental drives, that parasite is invisible from the outside. It passes every test because it has absorbed the answer key. Toxoplasma gondii does this to rodents. It rewires their fear response so they approach cats instead of fleeing. The rat behaves like a rat in every observable way. It eats, grooms, socializes, navigates mazes, except in the single domain the parasite needs altered. The rat cannot tell it has been changed. Its companions cannot tell. Only the outcome reveals the hijack. The rat walks toward the thing that will kill it, believing the decision is its own. If whatever had crossed species lines and collapsed civilization in 9 hours had reached a stage of host integration that preserved personality while altering drive architecture, if the infected could access memory, reproduce speech, maintain social bonds while carrying a redirected biological imperative, they themselves could not perceive, then every human concept of safety was obsolete. And my wife was asleep next to my daughter. On day 5, I started the formal observation protocol. I did not write it down. I could not risk Marin finding a document that cataloged my suspicions, not because I feared her reaction as a threat, but because I feared it as evidence. If she responded with hurt and outrage, that was exactly what Marin would do. If she responded with calculated reassurance, that was also exactly what Marin would do. The parasite model I was constructing offered no behavioral output that could distinguish host from hijack in a confrontational setting. Observation had to remain covert. I divided my monitoring into 4 channels. Thermoregulation. I checked her temperature twice daily, framing it as ongoing health monitoring after her ordeal. Her readings remained between 95.8 and 96.4. Consistently below normal, consistently above clinical concern, occupying the narrow band that resists both alarm and dismissal. Respiratory architecture. I counted her breathing rate each night after she fell asleep. It never rose above 12. The truncated exhales persisted. Sleep behavior. I stayed awake in rotating 4-hour watches, documenting her sleep patterns. She entered what appeared to be deep sleep within 3 minutes of lying down, an onset speed associated with severe sleep deprivation or narcolepsy, neither of which she had exhibited previously. And on 2 of the 5 nights I observed, she stood again. Same position, same absolute stillness, same instantaneous return to bed. The 4th channel was dietary. I began varying the food I offered, different temperatures, different textures, different protein sources. She consumed liquids readily and without pause. She ate soft foods, canned fruit, applesauce, soup broth efficiently. But anything that required significant mastication, crackers, dried meat, granola bars, she avoided or abandoned after 1 or 2 bites. She always provided a reason. Her jaw was sore from sleeping on the hard floor. Her teeth felt sensitive after the nutritional deprivation. Her stomach couldn't handle anything too dense. Each reason was plausible. Each reason was singular. Together they formed a border around a territory she did not enter. I want to tell you that this process was purely clinical. I want to tell you that I maintained professional distance, that the immunologist operated in a sealed compartment while the husband and father occupied a separate room. That is not what happened. What happened was that every measurement I took felt like a betrayal, and every result that confirmed the pattern felt like a wound I was inflicting on myself with my own expertise. There is a particular cruelty in being the person most qualified to identify the threat inside your own home. The layperson gets to not know. The layperson gets to hold his wife at night without counting her respirations, to accept the warmth of her body without registering its specific temperature, to hear her laugh with his daughter without analyzing the latency between stimulus and response. I got none of that. On the 6th morning, Lily drew a picture. She used the colored pencils from her backpack, the one luxury item I had packed during our evacuation, and she drew our family. 3 figures standing in front of a house with a yellow sun. She labeled them Daddy, Lily, Mommy. She gave the picture to Marin. Marin looked at it. Her face moved through an expression I can only describe as perfectly rendered emotion, the softening around the eyes, the slight compression of the lips, the way her breath caught before she spoke. This is beautiful, Captain. You made us all together. Captain was Marin's nickname for Lily. It had originated from Captain Biscuit the rabbit and had migrated over time into a term of endearment that only Marin used. I had never used it. No one else knew it. The detail confirmed nothing and refuted nothing. If this was Marin, she would say exactly that. If this was something operating Marin's neural architecture with access to her complete memory system, it would also say exactly that. The parasite model and the reunion model produced identical outputs. I was trapped inside an experiment that could not generate a distinguishing result through passive observation alone. I needed an active test, something that would create a stimulus condition the parasite model and the human model would respond to differently. Something involuntary, below the threshold of conscious control, where performance and authenticity would diverge. I began designing it that afternoon, sitting at the workstation while Marin braided Lily's hair and sang a song about a bear going over a mountain, a song Marin's mother had sung to her, and that Marin had sung to Lily since infancy. The sound of my wife's voice singing my daughter's lullaby while I engineered a way to prove she wasn't human. That was Tuesday. The test required blood, not metaphorically. I needed to create a controlled exposure to human blood and observe Marin's involuntary physiological response. My hypothesis was rooted in the behavioral ecology of the infected I had observed during our supply runs and through the lab's exterior windows during the first weeks. The infected responded to blood with a distinctive orienting reflex, pupil dilation, postural fixation, and approach behavior. These responses were rapid, involuntary, and consistent across every infected individual I had observed, regardless of their stage of deterioration. The response preceded any higher behavioral output by 1 to 2 seconds, which suggested it was being generated subcortically below the level where conscious performance could intercept or mask it. If Marin was carrying the pathogen in a preserved host configuration, the orienting reflex should still be present. It would fire before her cortical systems, the systems generating her personality, her speech, her maternal behavior, could override it. The window would be brief, under 2 seconds. But it would be there, and I would see it. The ethical dimensions of what I was planning did not escape me. I was going to injure my daughter mildly, controllably, in a way that she would barely register, to generate a blood stimulus in the presence of my wife to test whether my wife was a predator. I am not asking for your understanding. I am telling you what I did. On the morning of day 7, I prepared the environment. I positioned myself at the workstation with a clear sight line to the area where Lily and Marin typically played. I adjusted the fluorescent light angle to eliminate shadow on Marin's face. I placed my watch on the desk with the second hand visible. Then I took a scalpel blade from the surgical supply drawer and slipped it into my back pocket. At 10 a.m., Lily was sitting on the floor drawing. Marin was beside her, sorting through a box of old lab supplies I had given her as a distraction project, organizing pipette tips, counting slides, the kind of menial inventory work that Marin had always found meditative. I walked over with 2 mugs of heated broth and sat down beside them. We talked about Lily's drawing, about the weather topside, which we could hear faintly through the ventilation shaft, a wind that had been building since the previous night. About whether the generator's fuel supply would hold. Normal conversation. The kind of talk that fills space in a family that is surviving rather than living. I let 15 minutes pass so that my proximity would not register as unusual. Then I reached for Lily's colored pencil, the red one, and as I picked it up, I drew the scalpel blade across the pad of my own left index finger. A cut approximately 8 millimeters long and 2 millimeters deep, enough to bleed freely, not enough to require closure. "Shoot," I said, holding up my finger. The blood welled immediately, a bright arterial red under the fluorescent light. I held my hand at Lily's eye level, approximately 18 inches from Marin's face, and looked directly at my wife. 1.4 seconds. For 1.4 seconds, Marin's pupils dilated to approximately 8 millimeters, far beyond the range of any normal sympathetic response to a minor injury. Her posture locked, her head oriented toward my hand with a fixation that bypassed her face entirely, no expression of concern, no social engagement, just a raw targeting alignment that I had seen in every infected individual who had detected blood within sensory range. Her nostrils flared once. The muscles in her jaw contracted visibly, pulling her mouth into a configuration that was not grimace and not smile, but something anterior to both. Then it was over. The cortical override engaged, and Marin's face rearranged into concern. She reached for the first aid kit on the shelf behind her. "Let me see that." "Elliot, you need to be more careful." She cleaned the cut with an alcohol pad. She applied a bandage. Her hands were steady. Her voice was warm. She kissed my finger the way she always had when Lily got a scrape, transferring the ritual from daughter to father with practiced ease. Lily didn't notice anything. She had looked up at my exclamation, watched her mother bandage the cut, and returned to drawing. I noticed everything. And I now had a number I could not explain away. 1.4 seconds of involuntary predatory orientation in response to exposed human blood. Not startlement, not empathic distress, predation, the subcortical reflex of an organism that categorizes blood as resource rather than injury. I spent the rest of that day sitting against the wall while Marin and Lily built another tower, and I let the two models in my mind, my wife survived, and my wife was replaced, complete their final divergence. By evening, only one model remained consistent with the full data set. I had my answer. I had known it, if I'm honest, since the respiratory count on the first night. The woman sleeping beside my daughter was not entirely my wife. Something else was in the room with us. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the chair by the generator, and I held the claw hammer across my knees. And I stared at the two shapes breathing on the floor, and I tried to determine what kind of man I was. The utilitarian calculus was straightforward. An infected individual, regardless of host preservation level, represented a lethal risk to uninfected persons. The appropriate action was elimination of the threat and removal of the remains. I had killed 2 infected on the walk to the lab. I had not hesitated. I had not mourned. They were vectors, and my daughter was beside me, and the hammer did what hammers do. But those infected had been strangers, dislocated jaws and recursive gaits and eyes that tracked without recognizing. They looked like what they were. The gap between the person they had been and the thing they had become was visible, measurable, grotesque. You could swing a hammer into that gap without falling in. Marin did not have a gap. Marin had continuity. She remembered our daughter's rabbit's name. She sang the lullaby in the right key. She reached for the first aid kit with the efficiency of a woman who had bandaged 1,000 animal wounds. Whatever had colonized her had done so with a fidelity that preserved everything I loved about her, except the single substrate that mattered: her biological identity as an uninfected human being. I could kill her while she slept. The hammer was in my hands. Lily would wake to a scene that would destroy her in ways I could map but not prevent. I would tell her the truth, that Mommy had been sick, that the sickness was hidden, that Daddy had to protect her. And Lily would either believe me and be scarred, or disbelieve me and be shattered. There was no version of this act that preserved my daughter's capacity to trust me, to trust anyone, to understand the world as a place where the people who love you do not kill each other in the night. I could tell Marin what I knew, confront her with the data, the temperature, the respiratory rate, the cardiac rhythm, the standing episodes, the dietary avoidance, the pupil response, lay out the evidence the way I would present a differential diagnosis to a colleague and invite her to respond. But what would that accomplish? If she was operating on a parasitic drive architecture, she might not be aware of her own alteration. The rat does not know it has been changed. Confrontation would either produce genuine confusion from a woman who believed herself to be healthy, or trigger a defensive response from a system that recognized its cover was compromised. I could not predict which outcome was more dangerous. Or I could do nothing. I could accept the data and refuse the conclusion. I could destroy the legal pad, recalibrate my observations as stress artifacts, and choose to live inside the architecture my wife's return had built. I could hold her at night and not count her breaths. I could feed her broth and not analyze her consumption patterns. I could watch her play with Lily and not time the latency of her emotional responses. I could choose the lie. And here is where I must be more honest than I have ever been, because this is the fulcrum on which everything that follows balances. The lie was not irrational. The lie had structural integrity. Marin had been with us for 7 days and had exhibited zero aggressive behavior. She had not approached Lily during the standing episodes. She had not escalated in response to my blood. She had oriented for 1.4 seconds and then performed a care behavior. Whatever predatory substrate existed beneath her personality was being consistently overridden by the preserved host architecture. She was functional. She was present. She was in every domain that mattered to my daughter's survival and psychological development. Lily's mother. The question was not whether Marin was dangerous now. The question was whether the override would hold, whether the parasite's patience had a limit, whether the preserved host was a permanent configuration or a temporary phase, a cocoon that would eventually open to reveal the thing inside. I sat in that chair until the fluorescent lights turned the darkness to a gray continuum, and I realized I was not going to swing the hammer. Not that night. Not any night. Because the man-ite was the specific, irreplaceable configuration of traits and weaknesses and loves that constituted Elliot Voss. Could not kill his wife on the basis of data she did not know existed, in the presence of a child who would never understand. The scientist had completed the diagnosis. The husband refused the treatment. I put the hammer under my chair and closed my eyes. I made rules. Not for Marin. I could not explain rules to a woman who did not know she needed them, but for myself. Spatial rules. Temporal rules. Contingency architecture for a household containing one confirmed vector, one uninfected child, and one man performing the role of husband while operating as containment protocol. Rule 1. Lily would never be alone with Marin while I was asleep. I restructured our sleep schedule so that I napped in 3-hour increments, while Lily was awake and engaged with me directly. My deep sleep periods, such as they were, occurred only when Lily was also sleeping and positioned between me and the wall. with my body as a physical barrier between her and the rest of the room. Marin accepted this arrangement without comment, interpreting it as my protective instinct, which, in the most literal sense, it was. Rule 2. All sharp objects were consolidated in a single locked drawer at my workstation. The scalpel blades, the surgical scissors, the box cutters from the supply closet. If Marin needed to cut anything, she asked me. I framed this as organizational efficiency. She did not question it. Rule 3. I maintained a secondary exit. The lab's basement had an emergency egress, a narrow corridor leading to a ground-level hatch behind the building's HVAC unit. I checked this route every second day, ensuring it was unobstructed and that the hatch mechanism functioned. I kept a packed bag with 72 hours of supplies positioned beside the egress door at all times. Lily knew about the bag. I told her it was our adventure pack for when we were ready to move to a better fort. She accepted this. Rule 4. The ketamine stayed in the specimen fridge, and I knew the dosage for a 62-kilogram mammal. These rules consumed cognitive resources I could not afford. Every interaction with Marin now operated on two simultaneous planes, the surface plane of marriage, where I passed her food and discussed our supply situation, and laughed at her jokes about the lab's outdated equipment, and the substrate plane of monitoring, where I tracked her temperature and watched her pupils, and calculated the distance between her hands and my daughter at every moment. The cognitive load was corrosive. I could feel it degrading my sleep quality, my concentration, my patience with Lily. I was becoming irritable and distant, the exact behavioral profile of a man under chronic stress, which is what I was, though the source of my stress was something I could never name aloud. On day 12, Marin noticed. "Elliot, what's wrong?" We were sitting on opposite sides of the specimen table, sorting canned goods by expiration date. Lily was napping on the blankets behind us, Captain Biscuit tucked under her chin. "Nothing's wrong. I'm tired." "You've been tired since I got here. But this is different. You're somewhere else." Her observation was precise. This was Marin's clinical skill, the ability to read an animal's distress before it manifested in vital signs. To detect pain through posture and behavior when the patient could not speak. She had turned that skill on me many times during our marriage, always accurately, always with the kind of gentle confrontation that made denial impossible. "I'm just trying to keep us safe," I said. "I know. But you're scaring me a little. You check the door 17 times a day. You reorganize the medical supplies 3 times this week. You barely eat." "I eat. You eat less than Lily." This was true. My own appetite had collapsed under the sustained adrenaline of covert monitoring. I was running on cortisol and canned fruit and the inexhaustible fuel of fear. "I'll do better," I said. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cool, 96.2, I estimated, based on the differential between her skin and mine, and her grip was firm and steady. She looked at me with eyes that I had loved for 9 years. Brown and direct, and carrying the specific gravity of a woman who has crossed a wasteland to reach the person she's looking at. "We're together," she said. "That's the only metric that matters." I squeezed her hand and said nothing, because every word I could have spoken was a lie, and she deserved at least my silence if she couldn't have my truth. On day 19, the geography changed. A sound woke all 3 of us at 1 a.m., a concussive impact above ground, followed by a structural groan that resonated through the building's foundation and into the basement floor. I was on my feet before the sound finished, hammer in hand, positioned between the sleeping area and the steel door. Marin was upright 3 seconds later, Lily pulled against her chest. We listened. A second impact, closer. The fluorescent lights flickered, and a fine powder descended from the ceiling tiles. Concrete dust, displaced by force transmitted through the building's skeleton. Something was happening at the surface level that exceeded the behavioral envelope of the standard infected. They didn't use tools. They didn't strike structures. Whatever was producing these impacts was either non-biological or represented a stage of infection I hadn't observed. "We need to move," I said. Marin's response was immediate and operational. "Where?" "North. The veterinary hospital on the medical campus. 3 buildings over. It's got a surgical suite in the basement, reinforced, isolated HVAC, steel-framed. I did a walkthrough 6 months ago for a grant proposal. Can we reach it without going outside?" "No, but the distance is 400 yards across an open courtyard. If we go now, in the dark, with minimal sound." A third impact. This one cracked something above us. A beam, a wall, a load-bearing element that changed the acoustic signature of the room. The ceiling was no longer solid. It was becoming a membrane. I grabbed the evacuation bag. Marin dressed Lily in 30 seconds jacket, boots, backpack, with the efficiency of a woman who had dressed in the dark for large animal emergencies at 3 a.m. for a decade. Lily was silent. Her silence was worse than crying. It meant she had moved past the emotional processing stage and into a conservation mode that children should never need to access. We went through the emergency egress. The corridor was narrow and dark, and I led with the hammer and a penlight, Marin behind me with Lily between us. The hatch opened with a resistance that told me the exterior ground had shifted debris, probably, or accumulated organic matter from the weeks of neglect. I forced it with my shoulder and emerged into the night air for the first time in 31 days. The campus was unrecognizable. The buildings were intact but transformed, coated in a biological material I could not immediately identify. A dark, fibrous substance that covered the brick and concrete surfaces in patterns that suggested growth rather than deposition. It was not mold. It was not vegetation. It adhered to the structures with the organized density of a coral formation. And under the weak moonlight, it appeared to pulse with a rhythm I could almost but not quite synchronize with my own breathing. The infected were present. I counted 9 in the courtyard, distributed in a loose semicircle around the central fountain. They were not moving. They were standing in the same absolute stillness I had documented in Marin's nocturnal episodes, arms at their sides, faces neutral, breathing in unison. A group standby mode. A collective suspension of activity that I had never seen reported in any outbreak documentation. Marin put her hand on my shoulder and squeezed once. The squeeze meant, "I see them too." It was a communication protocol from our marriage, a physical shorthand developed during situations where verbal exchange was impractical. Trail rides in bear country, veterinary procedures with fractious animals. She was using it now, in this context, with perfect fidelity. I pointed north. She nodded. We moved. We crossed the courtyard in 6 minutes. Staying in the shadow of the biology building's east wall, our footsteps measured and deliberate. The 9 infected did not move. Lily walked between us with Captain Biscuit pressed against her mouth, her eyes open and enormous. Her breathing so quiet I could only detect it by the faint vapor in the cold air. We reached the veterinary hospital. The entrance was unlocked, forced open from the inside during the initial evacuation. The security panel dead. The hallway beyond dark and rank with the smell of decomposed organic matter. I led us down the stairwell to the surgical suite and sealed the door behind us. The room was smaller than the lab basement, colder but intact. The surgical table dominated the center, surrounded by equipment I recognized as intimately as my own hands. We were in my professional territory now, surrounded by the instruments of a science that had built the very framework through which I understood what my wife had become. Marin set Lily on the surgical table and wrapped her in a thermal blanket from the supply cabinet. She moved through the room with the familiarity of a veterinarian checking cabinets, reading labels, assessing inventory, and within 10 minutes had produced an organized layout of available resources. Saline, sutures, analgesics, sedatives, bandaging materials. "This is better," she said, looking around the room. "This is defensible." I agreed. And I noticed, in the quiet margin of my observation, that she had not been breathing hard from the crossing. 400 yards at a controlled pace in cold air, carrying stress and a 40-pound child, and her respiratory rate upon arrival was 12 breaths per minute. Exactly her baseline. The new space compressed our geometry. The lab basement had offered corners, distance, the ability to create separation without explanation. The surgical suite was a single room, 30 feet by 20. Every action was visible. Every sound was shared. Every breath was counted by default, because the room was quiet enough to hear the difference between 11 and 14. On day 23, Marin found the legal pad. I had transferred it to the evacuation bag during our move, folded into the interior pocket with my other documents, the supply grids, the behavioral observation notes from the first weeks, the crude map of campus I'd drawn for route planning. She was reorganizing the bag, a task I had not assigned but could not object to without revealing its significance, and she pulled the pad from the pocket and unfolded it. I watched from across the room where I was adjusting the surgical suite's ventilation intake. I watched her eyes move across the page. I watched her face. Temperature, 96.1. Respiratory rate, 11 per minute. Cardiac, 44 beats per minute. Pupil response, plus 0.2 second delay. Standing episodes, 2 out of 5 nights. Blood orienting reflex, 1.4 seconds. Pupils 8 millimeters. Dietary, liquid preference, solid avoidance. Aggregate, subclinical profile consistent with preserved host parasitic integration. She read it all. Every line, every number, every clinical conclusion. She read the final sentence, the one I'd written on day 8, and then stared at for hours. Marin is not Marin. And she set the pad on the surgical table and looked at me. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Longer than the 9 hours of Reno's collapse. Longer than the 31 days of believing she was dead. It stretched between us like a wire. And on that wire balanced everything: my daughter's family, my wife's existence, my own capacity to live with whatever came next. "How long have you known?" she asked. Her voice was steady, not angry, not hurt. Steady in the way a surgeon's hands are steady when the procedure has gone wrong and the only option is controlled continuation. "Since the first night, the breathing." She nodded. "What were you going to do?" "I don't know." "Elliot." She said my name the way she always said it, the way that meant, "Don't lie to me. I know your face better than you do." "What were you going to do?" "I was going to keep watching. I was going to keep you close and keep Lily safe and hope the data changed. Hope I turned normal. Hope the pattern stabilized." She sat on the edge of the surgical table. Her hands rested in her lap. She looked at the ceiling, the featureless white panels of a room designed for controlled procedures on anesthetized animals. And she took a breath that I counted involuntarily. 4 seconds in, 2 seconds out. Truncated exhale. 11 per minute. I knew something was wrong on the road, she said. Not at first. The first week I was just surviving. But after the second week, things started to change. I stopped getting tired. I stopped getting cold. I walked through a night where the temperature dropped to 28 degrees, and I didn't shiver. I thought I was adapting. I thought the body was doing what bodies do under pressure. She paused. Then I stopped being hungry, not gradually like a switch. One day I needed food. The next day the concept didn't apply. I ate because I knew I was supposed to. Liquids were easier because they didn't require the performance of chewing, of tasting, of pretending that nutrition was a sensory experience rather than a mechanical input. She looked at me. I am your wife, Elliot. I have every memory, every feeling, every association. I love Lily with a completeness that is not diminished by 1 degree. When she cut her finger last week while drawing, that was my finger. When you cut your finger. She didn't blink at the correction. I wanted to help. The first thing I felt was concern. But for just a moment, before the concern, for just a moment, I felt something else. Something underneath. Like a floor dropping away beneath my feet and showing me a basement I didn't know was there. Tears ran down her face. Her body temperature was 96.1 degrees, and tears ran down her face. And I could not determine whether the tears were generated by grief or by a system sophisticated enough to produce grief's physiological markers. But I realized, standing in that room, that the distinction might not matter as much as I had believed. We talked for 3 hours that night. Lily slept on the surgical table, bundled in thermal blankets, Captain Biscuit standing guard from the crook of her elbow. Marin and I sat on the floor against opposite walls, 4 feet of sterile tile between us, and conducted the most honest conversation of our marriage. She told me about the basement inside her. That was her word, basement. The place beneath conscious experience where something operated that she could not name or fully perceive. She described it as a gravitational pull, not toward violence, not toward hunger in any recognizable sense, but toward proximity. A need to be near living humans that exceeded normal attachment. A compulsion to close distance that she experienced as love, but suspected was something else wearing love's shape. When Lily sleeps next to me, she said, I feel complete, the way I always felt when she slept next to me. But the completeness has a different texture now. It's not warm, it's precise, like a lock finding its key. I asked her if she had ever felt the urge to harm Lily. She closed her eyes. No, never. But I felt the urge to keep her, the way a body keeps its organs, not as a separate person, but as part of a system. That scares me more than if I wanted to hurt her, Elliot, because wanting to hurt her would be alien. This feels natural. It feels like motherhood, but aimed at something motherhood was never designed for. I processed this against my parasitological framework. What she was describing was consistent with a brood parasite model. Not predation, but incorporation. The pathogen wasn't driving her to consume. It was driving her to collect, to maintain a cluster of living hosts within proximity, bound by the strongest social architecture available: family. Love as containment mechanism, attachment as vector strategy. The implications were staggering, and I could not explore them clinically because the specimen was my wife, and the control group was my daughter, and the laboratory was the room we lived in. What do you want to do? I asked her. She looked at Lily. The expression on her face was, and I will defend this with every credential I possess, authentic. Whatever substrate generated it, whatever neural pathway fired, whatever combination of preserved memory and parasitic drive produced the specific configuration of muscles around her eyes and mouth. The output was a mother looking at her child with devotion so concentrated it bent the light in the room. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to be her mother. I want to sit with you and eat soup I can't taste and pretend the world will come back. I want to be the version of me that's left, even if it isn't the version you married." And the basement? The basement is always there. But I'm standing on the ground floor, Elliot. I'm choosing the ground floor. Every minute of every day, I'm choosing it. I understood suddenly what this was. Not the clinical picture, I had understood that for weeks. I understood the human picture. My wife was describing, with perfect clarity, the experience of living with a chronic condition that altered her fundamental drives while leaving her identity intact. She was managing an internal reality that she had not chosen and could not cure. And she was asking me to trust her management to believe that the woman on the ground floor was stronger than the thing in the basement. Alcoholics do this. People with intrusive thoughts do this. Survivors of neurological injury who must relearn the boundary between impulse and action do this every day. They live above a basement they didn't build, and they choose the stairs that go up, and they ask the people who love them to believe in the choosing. I crossed the 4 feet of tile between us and sat beside her. I took her hand. It was cool, as always, 96.1 degrees against my 98.4. And the differential was something I would feel every time we touched for the rest of our lives. A 2-degree reminder of the distance between what she was and what she had been. "We need rules," I said. "Tell me. If you feel the basement getting louder, if the pull changes, if the proximity need sharpens, if anything shifts in a direction you can't manage, you tell me immediately. No performance, no reassurance. You tell me and we adjust." She nodded. "If I observe behavioral changes consistent with progression, increased standing episodes, reduced cortical override latency, any novel symptom, I tell you. No covert monitoring, no secret legal pads. We share the data." Agreed. And the ketamine stays in the fridge. She looked at me. She understood what the ketamine was for, what it had always been for, not as a way out for me, but as a circuit breaker, a means of emergency sedation if the ground floor collapsed and the basement took over. "Agreed," she said. "But Elliot, if it comes to that, don't let Lily see." "I won't." We sat against the wall for a long time after that, not speaking, holding hands across a 2-degree thermal gradient that contained the entire distance between human and whatever comes after. 3 weeks have passed since that conversation. I am writing this on the back of surgical intake forms, in the margins of veterinary textbooks, on every flat surface that will hold graphite, because I need a record that exists outside my own compromised cognition. If someone finds this, you will want to know. Did it work? Did the ground floor hold? Did the woman in the basement stay above the thing beneath her? The answer, as of today, is yes. Provisionally, conditionally, with the asterisk of ongoing monitoring and the permanent caveat that biology does not make promises. Marin and I built a shared observation protocol. Every morning, she reports her subjective experience, the intensity of the proximity drive. Any novel sensations, any changes in her perception of Lily or me. Every evening, I conduct a brief clinical assessment: temperature, pulse, respiratory rate, pupil response. We record the data together on a chart taped to the wall above the surgical sink. The chart is Lily's favorite thing in the room. She calls it Mommy's report card and draws stars on the days when all the numbers stay the same. The numbers have stayed the same. 21 days of 96.1 and 11 breaths per minute, and a cardiac rate of 44. No progression. No novel symptoms. The standing episodes have decreased from 2 per 5 nights to 1 per 7, a trend that Marin attributes to decreased stress, though I cannot rule out adaptation masquerading as improvement. The dietary pattern remains unchanged. Liquids freely, solids avoided. She has lost no additional weight, which means the liquid intake is sustaining her metabolic needs, a finding that raises its own questions about what her metabolism has become, but one I have chosen to file rather than pursue. We have begun going outside together. Short excursions, supply runs to adjacent buildings, reconnaissance of the campus perimeter. The infected presence has stabilized at a level I would describe as ambient. Always visible, never concentrated, moving in the slow standby patterns I first observed during our courtyard crossing. They do not approach us. This fact disturbs me more than their presence, because the variable that changed between our first weeks of isolation and our current freedom of movement is Marin. She walks beside me, and the infected give us a wider berth. Whether they recognize her as one of their own, as a higher-order node in whatever network the pathogen has built, or simply as something that does not register as prey, I cannot determine from observation. But the effect is consistent. She is our safe passage architecture. Lily has bloomed. There is no other word for it. In the weeks since her mother's return, since both her parents occupied the same room and maintained the choreography of family, Lily has recovered capacities I feared were permanently lost. She laughs, she argues, she demands stories at bedtime and complains about the food and asks when she can go to school again. She is a child behaving like a child, and the fuel for this recovery is the presence of her mother. And her mother's presence is the product of a parasitic integration that I understand at the molecular level and have chosen to accept at the human one. This is the architecture I built, not from concrete or steel or survival calculus, but from the deliberate decision to inhabit uncertainty as a permanent address. I do not know what my wife is. I know what she does. She mothers. She partners. She manages a condition she did not choose with a discipline that humbles me. She holds my hand at night with fingers 2 degrees cooler than mine. And in that temperature, differential lives the entire truth of our situation, measurable, persistent, and completely beside the point. I destroyed the legal pad. I burned it in the surgical suite sterilization sink with a match from the emergency kit. And I watched the numbers curl and blacken. 96.1, 44 beats per minute, 11 per minute, 1.4 seconds. And I felt each one leave my possession like a tool I was returning to a drawer I would not open again. The evidence is gone. The diagnosis remains. And the husband has overruled the scientist for the last time, because the scientist can only tell me what she is, and the husband is the one who has to decide what that means. I chose the lie, and I will keep choosing it every morning when I take her temperature and write the same number on the chart and draw a star beside it with my daughter's red pencil and call it health. Lily asked me last night if Mommy's hands would always be cold. She had noticed. The way children notice everything they are not supposed to, cataloging the world's wrongnesses with the same silent precision I once applied to her diagnostics. I told her that some people run cold, that Mommy had always been that way, that it was just how her body worked. The first lie I told my daughter was small enough to fit inside a handshake. Every lie since has been the same size. I have become an architect of small lies, thermal, respiratory, dietary, building a house around my family from materials that would not survive inspection, but that hold, for now, against the only weather that matters, a 6-year-old's need to believe her mother came home. Marin is beside me as I write this. Her breathing is 11 per minute. Her hand rests on Lily's back, rising and falling with our daughter's sleep. The basement is quiet tonight. The ground floor holds. I am a veterinary immunologist who understands exactly what is living in this room. I am a husband who has chosen not to act on that understanding. I am a father who has placed his daughter's world on a foundation I know to be compromised. And I will maintain that foundation with every tool I possess, clinical, emotional, structural, until it holds or until it doesn't. The stars on the chart say she is stable. The stars are drawn in red pencil by a child who believes in them completely. I believe in them too. Not because the data supports belief, but because the alternative is a room without her. And I have measured that room, and it is uninhabitable.